And this great disruption is the biggest geopolitical contest that probably we're ever going to see in human history between the world's number one power today, the United States, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. There is no question that this contest will gain momentum over the next decade. And that's why I wrote my book, Has China Won?, to explain what are the forces driving it. And that's what I'm going to do in my remarks today. Explain to you the nature of this US-China geopolitical contest. But even as I do so, I want to emphasize, especially to my fellow Asians, who, by the way, make up the majority of the world's population, that you should stop being passive. Stop being quiet. Speak out. Speak out loudly and clearly, and call upon the US and China to adopt a much wiser approach to managing this contest, because it will not just affect Americans and Chinese, it will affect the whole world, including all of Asia. Which is why we need to understand this contest, and after we do so, let's speak out. And that's the goal of my remarks today. Now, to explain the nature of this contest, I'm going to answer 5 questions. First question, what are the structural causes driving this contest? 2, what mistakes were made by US and China in this contest? But the third question, I suspect, is the one that you're all most interested in. Who will win this contest between US and China? Fourth question I'll answer is, how will other countries and regions react to this US-China contest? And finally, what can we do about it? How do we manage it? And that's when I'm going to reiterate my point again, that we should speak out in response to it, but to speak out intelligently and thoughtfully in response to it, we have to understand why it is happening. So this brings me to my first question. What are the structural causes driving this US-China geopolitical contest? And there are at least 3. The first one, by the way, this is a force that goes back thousands of years. It's one of the oldest ironclad geopolitical rules of history, which is that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. So when the United States is now making a massive effort to stop China from becoming number one, it is responding to a geopolitical impulse that's been around for thousands of years. And that's why you notice that even though Trump started this geopolitical contest, Trump is gone, Biden is in. Biden and Trump don't agree on anything except one thing, on China. So the geopolitical contest that Trump started, Biden is continuing. So it shows you that in geopolitics, it's not about personalities. It's about deeper structural forces that are at play. So when the United States tries very hard to stop China from becoming number one, it's responding to that old geopolitical impulse. But there are 2 other structural forces. The first one, everyone talks about. The second one, nobody talks about, because it's politically incorrect to speak about it. And that's the fear of the yellow peril in the Western imagination, a fear that's been there since the Mongols almost overtook Europe 800 years ago. Now, this is something no one in the West will ever mention to you, but it's important that we in Asia understand clearly that this is a factor at play because it explains the emotional dimensions of this US-China contest and why some of the actions that are being taken against China reflect a certain degree of irrationality, and that comes out of the yellow peril. Now, some of you may be wondering, come on, that cannot be true. Surely great countries are not driven by such raw emotions, such as the fear of the yellow peril. Let me just remind you that 130 years ago, the United States Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. That alone provides you proof that the yellow peril is real and we have to deal with it. And the third structural force that's driving this contest is a somewhat unusual bipartisan consensus in the United States that China has disappointed the United States. How has China disappointed the United States? Many Americans genuinely, sincerely, I must say, believed that when the United States opened up China's economy, subsequently, China's political system would also open up consequently, and China would then become a liberal democracy like the United States of America, and two liberal democracies, China and the US, could live happily ever after. Now, this may seem to you like a fairy tale. It's not a fairy tale. I can tell you that one of the top advisors to President Biden today, a friend of mine, Kurt Campbell, actually published an essay in the magazine Foreign Affairs explaining that that was what America expected China to become. But China clearly is not going to become a liberal democracy soon. And for those Americans who are so disappointed by this, I often say as politely as possible, why is it that a young state like the United States, which is less than 250 years old, with 1/4 the population of China, how can this young country like the United States believe that it can transform a 4,000-year civilization with 4 times the population? Now that's an example of a completely unrealistic assumption in American minds, and which is exactly why we need Asians to speak out and tell Americans a basic fact. China will be China. China will evolve and develop on the basis of its long history, traditions, and culture. America should give up any illusion that it can transform China. But you can see that these are the structural forces that are driving this contest. But they've also been aggravated, and this is my second question I'm going to address. What are the mistakes that were made? And I must emphasize that both sides have made mistakes in this contest. In the case of China, the mistakes are very clear. China alienated the American business community, and that alienation was very unfortunate because for decades, in the 1990s and 2000s, it was the American business community that would always say, stop, stop, whenever the United States government wanted to take actions against China, because they say, hey, don't spoil my biggest market in China. But as you know, when Trump launched his trade war in 2017, 2018, the American business community kept absolutely quiet. And they were obviously upset, aggravated by the fact that they felt that they had lost intellectual property in China, that there was an insistence on transfer of technology from American to Chinese firms, there wasn't a level playing field. All these complaints, by the way, are well known. You can find them on the websites of the US Chambers of Commerce in Shanghai and Beijing. So that was a mistake that the Chinese made. But the mistake that was made by the United States was in some ways a more fundamental one, because the United States decided, this is actually quite shocking, decided to launch a geopolitical contest against China without working out a strategy. Now, when you consider the United States has the best strategic think tanks in the world, the best universities in the world, the best known strategic thinkers in the world, how can it not have a strategy? But it doesn't. And this was confirmed to me by the greatest living strategic thinker today, Dr. Henry Kissinger, when I had a one-on-one lunch with him in March 2018, when I was doing research for my book, Has China Won? And I actually got his permission to say in the book that the United States doesn't have a strategy. And this actually comes through when I also now answer the third question, who will win? And here let me add a simple point. I think I'm basically addressing an Asian audience. If I was addressing a group of a few hundred Americans and I asked them a simple question, who will win this contest between US and China, they would look at me with total bewilderment. Of course America will win. America has won every geopolitical contest it engaged in for the last 130 years. It defeated Germany in World War I, defeated Japan and Germany in World War II, saw off the Japanese economic challenge, and as you know, won this mighty victory against the Soviet Union in the Cold War without firing a shot directly at the Soviet Union. So, the United States only wins. It cannot lose. In fact, Americans cannot even conceive of the possibility of losing. And here, for all those of us, and I consider myself in many ways a friend of America, we should actually try to help our American friends understand that they should consider the possibility of losing. And why is that so? And here too, the answer is very complicated. I'm truly sorry I can only give you a brief sense of it, but I hope you'll read more of it when you pick up my book. The Americans cannot conceive of the possibility of losing because they see this very simply and very clearly as a contest between a vibrant democracy in America and a rigid Communist Party system in China. And say, hey, democracies always defeat Communist Party systems. And that's what you saw in the Cold War. United States handsomely defeated the Soviet Communist Party. So what's the big deal? Another Communist Party? Surely the American democracy will defeat it. And to some extent, actually, I'm sympathetic to that argument. If this was actually genuinely a contest within a democracy in the United States and a rigid Communist Party system in China, yes, a democracy can win. But if you do a deeper analysis of the state of the American society and the state of Chinese society, a very different picture emerges. So the United States functionally today has gone from being a democracy towards becoming a plutocracy. What is a plutocracy? As you know, democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. A plutocracy is the government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1% on top. But I want to emphasize, I'm not the one who says this. The late Paul Volcker, the greatest head of the Fed the United States had, used to tell me, he was a friend of mine, the US has become a plutocracy. The Nobel laureate, Joseph Stiglitz, has written a book documenting how US has become a plutocracy. Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of Financial Times, has said the US is a plutocracy. And the evidence is there, right? United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% hasn't gone up in 30 years. So as another Nobel laureate said, there's a sea of despair among the American working classes. And that sea of despair explains how Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. And what's even more frightening, Donald Trump may come back in 2024 unless America takes care of the sea of despair among the white working classes. So American democracy is facing serious internal challenges. And that's why it's so unwise when you're facing so many internal challenges to now take on a major geopolitical contest against China, which, by the way, has gone in the opposite direction. Because in China today has transformed itself, right? And today China is functionally the world's largest meritocracy. What is a meritocracy? A meritocracy is a system, and I think many Singaporeans know this, where you try to pick the best and the brightest to run the society. And it shows in terms of the performance of the society. And if you had any doubts at all that China has now developed a much more high-performance government than the United States government, that proof was provided by COVID-19.